14 through 29, which is the story of what happens when Jesus and the disciples come down from the Mount of Transfiguration. And, we talk about people having a mountaintop experience. And, the disciples the three disciples truly had a mountaintop experience, which, by the way, it is interesting just to go through Scripture and notice how many extraordinary things happened on mountaintops. You think about Mount Sinai and what happened to Moses on the mountaintop. You think about Mount Nebo, Moses dying on the mountaintop, but only after he had seen the promised land there in Deuteronomy chapter 34. You think about Satan taking Jesus to a mountaintop and showing him all the kingdoms of the world. And, of course, the Mount of Transfiguration. So there really are some extraordinary mountaintop experiences in the Bible. But, as Jesus and Peter, James, and John were coming down the mountain, they were confronted by a tremendous failure on the part of the disciples. This man who had a boy who had been demonized for some time brought his son, and undoubtedly the man was intending to bring his son to Jesus, but when Jesus wasn't around, brought his son to the disciples, and the disciples thought, they had it in the bag, because they had been sent out earlier on the limited commission. In Mark's account, it's recorded for us in Mark 6, and when they went out on this limited commission, they're performing miracles, and they're casting out demons, and so they think for sure, hey, we can cast the demon out of, this boy, but they fail. And so in many ways, there's this parallel between Moses and Joshua coming down Mount Sinai to find Israel defeated in a moment of faithlessness as they're worshiping the golden calf, and Jesus and the disciples coming down this mountain and finding the disciples defeated because of their faithlessness. And undoubtedly, this is all intended to illustrate the fact that the disciples are faithless because they don't understand the true meaning of Jesus' messiahship. Okay, so as I recall, when class ended last time, we were looking at verse 19. So you got two sheets, so the sheet from last night, drop down to verse 19. So Jesus says, "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So, Jesus is he's frustrated. I think we pointed out at the end of class that this isn't the only time that Jesus expresses his frustration. In John 14, as Jesus is interacting with his disciples in the upper room, and they say, "Show us the Father, and that's sufficient." And Jesus said, "Have I been with you such a long time, Philip, and you've not known me? He who has seen me has seen the Father." God expressed frustration with Israel. Look at Numbers 14. And this is, if you turn the sheet over to the back, you'll see this on D. Look at Numbers 14. You look at what all God did for Israel in getting Israel out of Egypt. 10 plagues on the Egyptians. They leave Egypt. God parts the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross over on. God, feeds them with manna. God brings them water from a rock. Incredible miracles that God performed for Israel. But time and time and time again, Israel fell into sin. And now, this is Numbers 14 happens after Mount Sinai. So, the extraordinary events that happened at Mount Sinai for a year, now they've come to Kadesh Barnea, and the spies are sent out to see the promised land, to plan the attack. And 10 of the 12 spies are faithless. They don't trust God to bring them into the promised land. And so here's what the Lord said to Moses, Numbers 14, verse 11. How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? How long? Frustration. Well, that's the frustration Jesus has with this unbelieving and perverse generation. All right, so go back to Mark chapter 9 and let's look at verse 20. So they brought him, that is, they brought the boy, the demonized boy, to Jesus. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. So one thing that's clear when you study about these demons in the gospel accounts, the demons know exactly who Jesus is. Look at Mark chapter 1. Mark 1 and look at verses 23 and 24. So Jesus is in a synagogue and he's teaching. I think this is one of the most interesting stories of a demonized person. Because what you've got here is a man who is possessed by a demon, but he's in the synagogue. He goes to church with the demon. And he sits through the service. He just sits there and he's polite. He's not, making a ruckus or anything like that until a certain point. So Jesus has been teaching. Mark 1:23, just then, a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an impure spirit cried out. So he's just sitting all nice and quiet and polite, and then he cries out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So this demon who's in this little boy, as the boy is being brought to Jesus, the demon recognizes exactly who Jesus was. He wasn't impressed with the disciples. But whenever he sees Jesus, he knows exactly who Jesus is, so he reacts strongly. And so this boy, he falls to the ground. He's being carried, but he falls to the ground, and he rolls around, and he's foaming at the mouth. Again, just imagine how this father feels seeing his son like this. I mentioned last week the movie The Exorcist, and, obviously incredible liberties were taken with that movie, but still, if you've seen it, you can appreciate a little bit more what this man was going through, seeing how horrific that situation was, especially for that mother. Verse 21 of Mark 9. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." So the demon, the father says, is trying to kill the boy. Look at Mark 5. I know we were still making videos when we studied through Mark 5, but you remember the demonized man in Mark 5? There at Gadara. And this man had the legion. So, in the Roman military, a legion was a division with 6,000 troops in it. So I don't know if that means that he had, 6,000 demons in him, but he had more than one demon in him. He had a lot of demons in him. And these demons gave him super strength. You remember how the text says that he'd often been bound with chains, but he burst them asunder? And he spent his time in the graves as opposed to being in the town. Well, Mark 5:5 tells us this. "Night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones." So he would try to damage the body. So, I don't know if the idea is that these demons seek to deface and destroy what's been created in God's image or not, but, that certainly seems possible. And so in the case of this boy, the demon is constantly throwing him into the fire or the water. Now again, just imagine, how many lakes had this father jumped in to rescue his son? how many times had this father pulled his son out of the fire and then tried to put the fire out of his clothes? This was something that had been happening to this boy for some time. And he says that the demon was trying to kill the boy, but, the boy was still alive. It doesn't seem like the demon couldn't kill the boy because of the demon's own inability. A demon has that ability. It would seem more likely that God just didn't grant the demon permission to do that. God granted the demon permission to possess the boy and to torment the boy, but not to kill the boy. That's similar to what we read about in the book of Job. Remember Job chapter 1? So Satan presents himself with the angels, and God asks Satan where he's been, and Satan says he's been, roaming to and fro on the earth. And God asks Satan, well, have you considered my servant Job? Which is it boggles the mind that God would make a suggestion of that sort to Job, or to Satan. Have you considered looking at Job? There's no one like him on the earth. Upright, just, fears me. And Satan says to God, well, that's just because you put a hedge of protection around him. If you remove the hedge, he'll curse you to your face. And God says to Satan, Job chapter 1 and verse 12, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. And so you know how Satan goes out and destroys all of Job's property, kills all 10 of Job's children. Satan comes back. And, Satan says, well, the only reason Job has maintained his integrity is because you've not allowed me to afflict his person. Skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. And God's answer, Job 2 verse 6, very well then, he's in your hands, but you must spare his life. So the point I'm making is that God has Satan on a leash. And he allows Satan to do only so much. And so maybe it's the case that, this demon, while he would have loved to have killed the boy, he was allowed to afflict the boy, but as in the case of Job, he wasn't allowed to go all the way and kill the boy. Now, you see on C, there under verse 21, it's heart-wrenching to see a child suffering in this way. We don't know how old the boy was. We don't know how old the boy was whenever the demon began to possess him, but the father says the demon had been troubling him from childhood. And that's kind of hard emotionally to take. That God would allow a child to suffer. But, that's a part of the revelation of Scripture. Think about David's son. Remember, David commits the adultery with Bathsheba, and she becomes pregnant, kills her husband to cover up the pregnancy, and finally, after a period of time, David is confronted with Nathan the prophet. And Nathan brings David to repentance, and God takes away the guilt of David's sin, but what does God do? God afflicts the child with an illness. And rather than, taking the child's life immediately, that illness lasts for 7 days. And all that time, David is fasting and David is pleading with God to have mercy on the child. But at the end of the 7 days, the child dies. How do we factor that in? Well, all we can say is God is God. God is the creator. God owns everything. You can never say to God, relative to anything he does with any of his creation, you've done wrong. It's God's. And at least in the case of David's child, he suffered for 7 days, but he's in glory. David wanted to go where the child went. I can't bring him back. I'll go to him. He can't come to me. And so these are things that emotionally they're hard for us to figure. A few weeks ago, studied about the boy that was, the man that was born blind in John 9. Why was he born blind? Not because his parents had sinned. Obviously not because he had sinned. But he was born blind so that he could be healed by Jesus at that particular point in time so that glory could be brought to God. So, here he is suffering as a blind child, suffering all of his life for a spiritual purpose. So, we have to be very careful that we're not so emotionally affected by these things that we don't allow God to be God and that we somehow charge God with wrongdoing. God never does wrong. So look at the Father's statement here in verse 21. Verse 22. The Father says, into verse 22, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can do anything. That's a significant statement. The Father seems to have lost a little bit of faith because, he brought the demonized child to the disciples, but the disciples couldn't do anything because of their lack of faith. And so now he says to Jesus, if you can do anything. Now contrast that with the statement of the leper back in chapter 1 of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 40. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and begged him on his knees, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Now think about how different those statements are. This Father says, if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us, whereas the leper said, if you are willing, you can make me clean. You see, this Father got the if in the wrong spot. If you're willing, that's the right spot for the if, not if you can. You can. The question is if you are willing. So Jesus, and frankly, I'm thankful the Father said that to Jesus because I like what Jesus said next. Look at verse 23. Jesus picks up on the if you can. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. I love that prayer. I think that's a good prayer for us all to be praying. I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Help my faith to grow. Now, Jesus' statement to the boy's father, if you can, everything is possible for one who believes. That really points out the unbelief in the Father's heart, but it also shows the reason why the 9 disciples couldn't cast the demon out. Jesus says explicitly, everything is possible for one who believes. The disciples couldn't cast the demon out. Therefore, the problem was the disciples' unbelief. And we're going to say this, notice this. You'll see it on the sheet, the next sheet. But remember, we pointed out that in this particular section of Mark, Mark is carefully constructed. All the biblical books are carefully constructed. They say what they say, where they say them, for a reason. You just have to figure out what that reason is. And so, Jesus performed so many miracles. He said so many things that if everything were recorded, John says, the world couldn't even contain the books. So what these gospel accounts say, they say for a reason. And so remember, in Mark's presentation, you get these 2 healing stories of blind people. In Mark chapter 8, you've got, the blind man there in Bethsaida who is healed partially. He sees men as trees walking, and then he's healed fully. And then on the other side of that, in chapter 10, you got blind Bartimaeus who's healed of his blindness. And what and when you just look at all the material in between, it seems like the point is, this is the section where the disciples' blindness is really focused in on. And, the disciples see, but they don't see. They're like that man in Bethsaida. They see men as trees walking. They see Jesus partially. Peter declares, you're the Messiah. you're the Son of the living God. But then when Jesus says, yeah, and I'm going to go and be betrayed, and I'm going to be crucified and raised again the third day, Peter says, no, that won't happen to you. So he sees who Jesus is, but he sees, partially. So everything in between is about Jesus fully opening up the disciples' eyes. So the reason why the disciples here have this unbelief is because they don't fully trust what Jesus has been saying about the true nature of his messiahship. And we'll talk about that in a few verses. But then, as the Father exclaimed, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief, in that split second, this man's plea of dependence removes him from the unbelieving and adulterous generation, and now he stands even above the apostles as a believer. I do believe, help my unbelief. So verse 25. When Jesus saw the crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. So the text doesn't say that Jesus and the man separated themselves from the crowd, but clearly they did. They'd withdrawn from the crowd. And so, Jesus wants to perform this miracle privately. And we've seen this tendency. I've got 3 instances here where Jesus in recent chapters will perform miracles privately. In the case of Jairus' daughter there in Mark 5. You remember how he kicked the mourning crowd out of the house and took with him in there Peter, James, and John? Again, they got to experience things that the 9 didn't, as we saw on the Mount of Transfiguration. And he went in, just allowed Peter, James, and John, Jairus, and his mother, and his wife in there with the little girl. And Jesus heals her, and, once it kept quiet. And then, chapter 7, we read about Jesus performing the healing away from the crowd. And in chapter 8, out of the city. And, he gives the command for it not to be told. So Jesus, wants to limit the amount of publicity that his miracles receive. And so whenever he saw the crowd running to the scene, he went ahead and cast the demon out. You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out and never enter him again. What seems to be implied in Scripture is that sometimes people who were exorcised of their demons became demonized again. Look at Matthew 12. Matthew 12. And look at verse 43. Matthew 12:43. When an impure spirit comes out of a person, it goes through arid places seeking rest and does not find it. That is an interesting thought. It goes through arid places seeking rest. Why dry places? Why not wet places? Well, that's been the subject of a lot of people who've really erased their imaginations on that. Demons are often associated with desert. But anyway, then it says, I'll return to the house I left. Well, the house is a person's body. I'll return to the house I left. When it arrives, it finds the house unoccupied, swept, clean, and put in order. He finds this person that he left all ready to be possessed again. Then it goes and takes with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself. That's going to be an important point. I don't have it on the sheet, but 7 spirits more wicked than itself. Just like not all evil people are equally evil, not all demons are equally evil. So there are some demons that are more evil than other demons. But here this evil spirit, finding 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, they go in and they live there. So that brings out the point that sometimes people are possessed by more than one demon, like in the case of Legion. And anyway, the final condition of that person is worse than the first. But the point is, now this is told parabolically. Of course, you know the nature of the parables. But at any rate, it seems that some people who were demon-possessed and had the demons cast out could be repossessed. But Jesus says to this evil spirit, don't enter him again. All right, verse 26. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. So, the spirit didn't want to leave the boy's body. Again, you see different places whenever Jesus, comes into the presence of these evil spirits, they say to Jesus, listen, what do we have to do with you? Leave us alone. They don't want to be, they want to remain possessing the bodies that they're in. You see that several places. But demons had to obey Jesus. Look at chapter 1, verse 27. So, we noticed this possessed man in the synagogue earlier. In chapter 1, verse 27 says, the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, what is this, a new teaching and with authority? He even gives orders to impure spirits and they obey him. So demons had to obey Jesus. And oftentimes when a demon would be cast out, it would respond, very loudly. Here, he convulsed the boy violently, but you look at this exorcism here in Mark 1, look at verse 26. Verse 25, Jesus said to the demon, be quiet. He said sternly, come out of him. Verse 26, the impure spirit shook the man violently, and he came out with a shriek. He wasn't wanting to leave, but he had to leave because of Jesus' authority. All right, verse 28 and 29 of Mark 9. After Jesus had gone indoors, so, Jesus and the disciples, they leave the man and the boy that the demon has been cast out of. They leave the mountainside. They go into a house. His disciples ask him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, this kind can come out only by prayer. Now, look at Matthew's presentation of this. Look at Matthew 17. Matthew 17. Look at verse Acts. Why couldn't we drive it out? Verse 20. He replied, because you have so little faith. And by the way, in Matthew's gospel account, emphasis is given time and again to the disciples' little faith. And then that's contrasted with the great faith of, say, the Gentile centurion. Because you have such little faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, if mustard seed sized faith would enable one to perform such an incredible thing as to move a mountain, the disciples really did have little faith. That's why they couldn't cast it out. They had little faith. What gave the disciples authority to drive out demons? It was their relationship with Jesus. You remember Mark 3, verse 15? As Jesus is, naming the 12 apostles and commissioning them. Mark 3, 14 and 15 says he appointed the 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. It was only the disciples' relationship with Jesus that gave them authority over demons. But keep in mind, their relationship with Jesus is out of whack now because they don't have faith in it. He's saying, I'm going to be crucified and I'm going to be resurrected, and they don't know what that means. So their faith is out of whack. They're out of a relationship with Jesus. Jesus said this kind can only come out by prayer. It was only by their spending time with God in prayer that they would realign themselves with God's will, get their faith right, get their relationship right with Jesus again, and be able to drive out the demons. Now, that statement, this kind, can only come out by prayer. That implies that not all demons are the same. And we noted that, again, he takes 7 other demons more evil than himself. Look at Ephesians 6. Ephesians 6. This is a pretty well-known passage among us, but it tells us a little bit something about the ordering of the demonic realm. So Paul tells us, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. I mean, why didn't he say we wrestle against evil spirits? We wrestle against demons. I mean, why did he go into this? It's against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm. Well, because apparently there is some sort of hierarchy among demons. You know, Satan obviously is their king, but then there's a categorization. You know, just like in the angelic realm, you know, Paul makes the same thing, makes the same statements concerning angels in different places, like Colossians 1:16. You know, you read about archangels. You read about the archangel Michael. So seemingly there's some sort of categorization among the demons, and some demons were harder to cast out than other demons. They had more power. They had more obstinacy. They were more bent on hurting. You know, again, the 7 demons more evil than himself. All right, any comments, any questions about this? Yes, sir.
Yes, Mike. I know you've touched on it before. Like the King James Version in verse 29, it says about prayer and fasting.
Right.
I know you explained that before in the past, but I was wondering, when Jesus went into the wilderness, he fasted for 40 days. It says Cornelius fasted. I guess different instances in the Bible. Well, I don't know, maybe is that missing also, the other instances concerning fasting?
Now, interestingly enough, there are other instances where in modern versions fasting is left out, where it's found in the King James. You know, another notable instance is 1 Corinthians 7:5, where Paul is giving instructions concerning husbands and wives and their sexual relationship, and says, you know, don't deprive one another, or the King James, don't defraud one another except for a season, that you come together, or for a season for prayer and fasting, that you come together again, lest Satan tempt you for your lack of self-control. That's not the word of the King James, but something like it. But it includes fasting there. You know, it seems like, well, here's what we know from church history. As the centuries progressed, there was a tendency more toward asceticism. You know, you see that, for instance, relative to clergy. You know, the point in time came in the 3rd century, I believe it was the 3rd century, where clergy was to be celibate. You just see this greater tendency toward denying yourself. Monasticism and all of that, comes to prominence, a few centuries later. But this fasting, as this asceticism takes root, the later manuscripts find fasting added in places that you don't find it in earlier manuscripts. So still in modern Bible translations that I think are translated from better manuscripts. You see, like the King James, it was translated from about a half dozen manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, the earliest of which was not later than the 10th century A.D. And in fact, the Greek manuscripts it was translated from didn't even have the last 6 verses of Revelation in it. But rather what Erasmus did was Erasmus, who came out with the first printed Greek New Testament in 1517, he took the Latin Vulgate and he translated back from Latin into Greek. And that is the text that the King James translates. So it's not actually from a true Greek manuscript. And in doing so, in translating those last 6 verses back from Latin into Greek, he introduced 22 variant readings that aren't found in any Greek manuscript. But anyway, the point being, I think the best manuscripts, it's not there. And I think that you can see a historical reason why scribes would add it, because of that greater tendency toward asceticism. Now there's still a legitimate conversation that needs to go on concerning fasting, because there's still a lot of passages that teach fasting, talk about fasting, like in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, etc. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And that will come up on a Sunday not very far down the road from Lewis's book.
That's right. Yeah, Jack Lewis has a whole chapter on it and has an interesting take. So, other comments?
I have a quick comment. So in here, whenever he tells the apostles that they couldn't drive out that demon because they didn't have the faith needed, and then you explained that they didn't have the faith because they hadn't been praying enough. Is that?
Well, so probably, but not necessarily. It seems to me the best explanation for this kind comes only out by prayer. It's the point that they need to spend time with God to realign themselves with God and God's will. Right now they're not thinking about God's will. They think they are, but they're not thinking about God's will. They're viewing things through the lens of their own preconceived ideas, man's ideas. You remember Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You don't pursue the things of God, but you pursue the things of men." In Mark chapter 8, after Jesus had said that he was going to be crucified, and Peter said no, Mark 8 verse 32 or 33. So I think that's kind of the idea. In spending time in prayer, they'll be realigning themselves with God's plan. May not be just so, but that's the best connection that I can see. Yes, sir.
Just kind of a thought here. This demon apparently he calls a deaf and mute spirit. So
Right.
I assume this boy cannot hear and cannot speak.
Right.
And I've always pondered, could he hear and speak immediately after this, or did he have to learn, as many children do who can't hear well when they're small,
Right.
and finally they get tubes in their ears and they can hear sounds and language develops and all that. It's just a thought that kind of hit me here.
That is an interesting thought. Yeah, because we don't know how old he was when that happened. But Nick, let me say one other thing. This is one of the, you understand that, it's a real debate as to whether or not demon possession still occurs, and whether or not, if it does occur, demons can be cast out today. And if it does still occur, then that's our text. How would a demon be cast out? Well, it would be by prayer. So, and I think it's an interesting question. And I'm not sure where I fall on it. There are some interesting stories out there. And, I sure don't believe every one of them. But there are some.